Thank you so much, and thanks to everyone for coming inside on this beautiful early summer afternoon to think about money culture and the Merchant of Venice. I'm so incredibly excited to be here and introduce this great panel to you, and to also think about how this play asks us to think about our own experience of living in a culture in which human relations and the way in which we live our lives are mediated through and to some extent structured by the culture of money. It's something I've been kind of thinking about in relation to this play for many years, and when I learned that we would be lucky in New Haven to get to see this incredible experimental production of Merchant of Venice that was commissioned for a live performance in the Venice Ghetto several years ago, I just was incredibly pleased and excited, and I'm very glad that we're able to sort of be here today and have this conversation. I've brought together I think you guys are really in for an incredible treat, because I got to bring some of my favorite people in the world, and also people with very different kinds of background and expertise. We are not all of us professional Shakespeareans up here, although some of us are. But everyone has, like everyone in the audience, we all have a relationship and understanding of money culture, and we're going to try to think about how this play enables us to make these kinds of observations and commentaries and sort of think through the way in which we live our own lives, in addition to the way in which great art helps us reconsider those lives. So I'll just quickly introduce in a kind of abbreviated form the members of the panel, and then we'll go into a whole bunch of different things, including some short live performances. There are fuller bios of all these distinguished people up on the Arts and Ideas website. So just going down the line here, Eric Blachford is a co-founder and former CEO of Expedia.com. He's dressed in his Silicon Valley uniform. And he also was ex-president and CEO of IAC Travel, which included Expedia, Hotels.com, and Hotwire. He has run companies including Butterfield and Robinson, Couchsurfing, and TerraPass, and is a board member of multiple internet companies including Zillow, Glassdoor, Peloton, Choose Energy, and Liftopia. He brings, as you now know, a kind of venture capital perspective to our group, but I also can testify about his particular experience and liveliness as a Shakespearean based on my seeing his performance of Sir Toby Belch in the fall of 1985. Not to date us in the audience at all. Going down or date us for the audience. Going down the row is Holly Dugan, who is a professor of English and Shakespeare at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. For the past several years, she's been teaching an introductory course on literature and the financial imagination, which is particularly popular with undergraduate students in the business school, as well as the School of Arts and Sciences. And she is working to develop a minor in English for business majors at GW. She has won university-wide teaching awards, directed the Dean Scholar Program in Shakespeare for GW for several years, and is the author of an extraordinary book called The Ephemeral History of Perfume, about pre-modern scent, in 2011. Next in line is Judy Chevalier, who teaches here in New Haven at the Yale School of Management. Areas of research include finance and industrial organization. Recent research includes the interaction between customer reviews and firm strategy, consumer foresight in markets for durable goods, the economics of electronic commerce, and other areas. She is a former co-editor of the American Economic Review and of the Rand Journal of Economics. And then at the end of the row, Tara Bradway is the artistic director and co-founder of the Adirondack Shakespeare Company. With that company, she has performed in more than 40 productions of Shakespeare since 2009. Her standout performances including the role of Portia in Merchant of Venice, Cassius and Julius Caesar, and the title roles of both Richard II and Hamlet. Dr. Bradway also earned her PhD in English at St. John's University in 2017 with a dissertation entitled The Actor as Critic, which explores the actor's experiences as a mode of critical interpretation of Shakespeare's plays. So our general project this afternoon is to think about how Merchant of Venice enables us to understand money culture and what the play says to us and what we in our own experiences can say to it. So I thought that each member of the panel was just going to do a little bit of an introductory understanding of what their perspective leads them to think about Merchant of Venice. So we'll just go down the road.
Sure. Well, so as Steve said, I come from sort of the venture capital world in San Francisco and Silicon Valley, which means, for those who aren't familiar with that, I spend my time looking at early stage companies, taking equity stakes in them, helping them to grow bigger and hoping that they sell, and also looking at later stage companies, public companies, as well. And so I spent a lot of time in and around investing, around lending, around finance, but also around all the effects of these giant rivers of money flowing through the streets of San Francisco over the last little while, and the social impacts that those have. I've got teenage kids. I'm very conscious of how they're growing up and what they see in the narratives that play out, not only in our friends in terms of parents, but also in the sort of the world they see around them. And so I look at something like Merchant, and I think, boy, it's kind of amazing, first of all, that a story could be told with such incredible foresight about the impact of different financial practices on different social mores, and also just the things that people are willing to do to be able either to enable other people financially or to advantage themselves financially. So looking forward to a great discussion.
I am someone who has been thinking about this play in a very scholarly way for a very long time. But more recently, in my work with the business students in the business school at GW, I've begun to shift how I think and teach this play. Rather than just focusing on its historical dimension, I've begun to explore what it allows us to ask about all kinds of different environments, both our fictions about how they should operate and the realities of the culture that defines them. And so in teaching this play, a play with a very difficult history, one that rightfully is debated about whether or not it should be taught, and if so, how, given its politics. The questions that I think it adds to a syllabus like mine is the ability to really think through what the power of money is and how material incentive might be able to allow different folks to come to the table that wouldn't do so otherwise, and then what the realities are when we're sitting at that table and the cruelty that can be inflicted in those moments. And for my students, it allows us to, in some ways, think about the space that we meet in, which is the classroom, another space that has the fiction of us getting along because it's materially expedient for us to do so, but in reality is more complicated.
Okay, so I'm the economics professor here, so I will probably take the perspective. I am definitely the least Shakespeare savvy of the people here. And what's interesting about well, there are many interesting things about the Merchant of Venice, but what's interesting about the Merchant of Venice from my perspective is the extent to which economists are really drawn to it as something which, as Eric said, is sort of prescient in anticipating some themes in economics. And what's interesting is, he mentioned the social piece, but really even just the way in which the play addresses some economics issues are surprisingly sophisticated and ahead of its time. So it's addressing the issue of patience and interest, the issue of risk and collateral, and in particular something that's very distilled in the play and a really sophisticated economic concept is the role of the state in enforcing contracts and the kind of trade-offs the state faces in contractual enforcement and the limitations of that. And so the play is really addressing a set of issues that economists have really thought hard about for a long period of time. I'll just mention briefly in particular, I'm sure most people who know about the history of the play know that, at the time, charging interest for a loan was, fairly scandalous and was considered, Christians did not do it. And many of you probably, one of the ways I think about the play is, the play is at this historical moment where, there's a landed aristocracy in the play, but a kind of emerging merchant class. And one way I think about the play, and I think economists think about the play, is kind of in light of what comes next, which is industrialization, right? And so John Stuart Mill said, argued that cultures that hadn't gotten over social impediments to borrowing and lending were slow to industrialize because they didn't have the means to undertake large investments for things like factories. And so I think of The Merchant of Venice as kind of showing us a spot along this road of financial and economic development, and the way in which this sort of financial structures that are explored in the play really lead to some of the more, important sort of not just societal changes, but sort of economic and changes and progress that occurs later. And so from the lens of economics, it's really a very fascinating play.
Hi, I come from this play from the perspective of a theatrical productionist. I first encountered this play in 2007 when I played Portia for the first time with a company called Theater of the Seventh Sister in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And then I performed the role again in 2011 and 2012 with my company, the Adirondack Shakespeare Company. And then in 2016, I conducted or directed the play. So my perspective is primarily actually coming through the character of Portia and in looking at different moments in the play and always trying to make a choice for the highest stakes and finding the highest drama in any particular moment. So that's kind of the perspective that I'm coming at it from, but I'll keep it short so we can continue.
Excellent. And so our structure for this afternoon will be to think about these large ideas of risk, anxiety, and generosity, things that dominate, I think, or at least feature in our own relationship toward money today and the way we think about economic and mercantile culture. And so what I've asked Tara to do is to expand her playing. She will give us a little piece of Portia at the end of our evening, but she's also going to perform a speech of Bassanio's and a speech from the servant clown Lancelot Gobbo. So the first speech about risk is part of Bassanio, the kind of leading man in the play. It's his plea, leading man-ish, his plea for money. He's asking Antonio the merchant he's already lost some money and he's asking for more money. So this is the idea of financial risk as Bassanio is articulating it to his wealthy buddy.
In my school days, when I had lost one shaft, I shot another, the self-same flight, the self-same way, which I did shoot the first, with more advised watch to find the other fourth. And by adventuring both, I oft found both. I urge this childhood proof because what follows is pure innocence. I owe you much, and like a willful youth, that which I owe is lost. But if you please to shoot another arrow that self-way which you did shoot the first, I do not doubt as I will watch the aim, or to find both, or bring your latter hazard back again, and thankfully rest debtor for the first.
So we chose this one to think about risk and how it understands risk and how it performs, risk as part of the financial transaction. So, Judy, do you want to start us off in having a little conversation about risk in the arrow speech?
Sure. So my first response to the arrow speech is probably what most people's first response to the arrow speech is. Oh, you want him to throw good money after bad. That's pretty close to my last response to the arrow speech too. But it actually raises, I think, an interesting issue about risk and how, again, I'm going to go down the economics path, how economists think about risk and the kind of two kinds of risk that are present in the play. So economists distinguish a couple kinds of risk. One is just risk, like when Antonio puts his ships in the ocean, there may be a storm, and if there's a storm, the ships will wreck. By the way, I'm hoping we can have spoilers here, right? Everybody hopefully who's here is familiar with the play. The ships will wreck. The ships may wreck, and that's a kind of risk. The other kind of risk, and the Arrow speech really addresses this second kind of risk, is what we call in economics moral hazard, which is the idea that if I loan you money and you may not repay it, and if you don't repay it, it's not really always because some terrible thing happened to you that was out of your control, but possibly you just didn't repay it. You were too lazy, too gluttonous to repay it, which I think seems fair in the characterization of this character. And so, the play does some interesting things with risk and these two kinds of risk. And one of the things I find interesting about it is, of course, Antonio's bond is needed to get the loan because, no one would loan money to his friend. And Antonio is kind of taking what we think of as the good kind of risk, or, what kind of sensible risk. He's sent a whole bunch of different ships out into the ocean. He's got a diversified portfolio, but things go wrong and he loses, his risk goes against him. And what I find kind of a sort of interesting twist in the play is the scheme of, wooing Portia to get rich, which is kind of a cockamamie scheme. That actually pans out, whereas the sensible scheme fails to pan out. And so the kind of interplay between the personal and the professional and the good risk and the bad risk and the different kinds of risk, I think really come out in that speech.
Do you guys want to add to that? I mean, risk and hazard are such a kind of through line in the play. I mean, the term hazard becomes almost a sort of refrain. Hazard is the thing that we do in order to enable the possibility of financial return, right? In a world in which interest is immoral or theologically suspect, it is only hazard that enables the possibility of profit. If you risk yourself, your money, your person, then it's okay to take a profit because you've proven yourself ethically not suspect.
Yeah, I think one of the things listening to you speak about this that I find so fascinating about the opening of the play is that there are different ways to evaluate that moral hazard, and that we have some standards for friends and others for not friends. And that line is so murky in the opening of this play, and I think there's a real, the repeated and insistent emphasis on testing throughout is there right there in that opening line. Let's go and try my credit and see what my credit can do. And that to me is such an interesting moment, especially teaching first years, to really think through a lot of very sensible personal finance rules as well, right? They all have a friend like this who never seems to have their wallet, who seems to need to put his money in clothes he can't afford in order to impress a woman who does not need that standard necessarily. And also, it's a great moment to think through what it might mean to use credit wisely and unwisely, and then also what it might mean to have a bond with a friend and to test it financially. Usually I just say never sign a loan for a friend. But this play begins with that, and as you know, it rewards.
So, maybe I'm from California. This idea of the good money, bad money. I mean, we don't really have seasons in the same way. I don't know that we think of money as good or bad. I mean, I look at that speech and I think it's the classic entrepreneur pitch. It's the chutzpah of being able to come in and say, look, the problem isn't that I lost money, it's that I didn't lose enough money. And if I just had a little more to put into it, and I think, there's a basic truth in here that sometimes the money doesn't necessarily go to the best handicapped alternative. It actually goes to the person who is most persuasive in getting the money. And in this case, okay, it's not directly persuasive in getting the money, it's persuasive in getting, sort of leveraging the love of a friend to guarantee his loan. But I think that very human dynamic is really important. I mean, that's he sort of, remember the arrows, shooting the arrows. And when you think about it, it's like, well, that doesn't make total sense, actually. You're going to bring one arrow back, maybe you'll find the arrow, but you might just lose both arrows too. But if you're persuasive enough, you're Elon Musk, right? And suddenly you've got people actually competing to give you money. And I think it's a pretty perceptive thing, because after all, it is true that the enterprise to go and woo and win Portia, I mean, it's not long odds, right? From what we see in the play anyway, and yet there it is, it succeeds. And I almost guarantee you that the next, if there's Merchant of Venice, part deux, what happens is the next guy goes, well, remember when he went and got Portia? Well, now I'm going to do a very similar thing, so give me some money. This is what happens when you get a true non-Shakespearean on the panel.
I mean, it actually brings up the question of how unique Portia is in the play. I mean, and we'll come back to this, I think, when we get to the Portia section. I mean, Portia as a principle, I mean, if all the money in Venice is on some level money that has to be earned or managed or worried about, Portia just is sitting on a mine and has infinite money and doesn't money that she doesn't have to earn or manage or worry about. And worry and anxiety is sort of the next step on our conversation this evening, and that obviously money is a source of anxiety for many, many people in and beyond this room. And so there are a bunch of moments in which this surfaces in the play. Obviously, in Bassanio's worry that he needs the fancy clothes to go impress the wealthy woman, and that's why one of the reasons he needs the loan. But one of the strange speeches in the play that I'm totally obsessed with and have been for about 20 years is the speech of the servant Lancelot Gobbo, who is trying to decide if he's going to leave the employment of the wealthy moneylender Shylock and go join the serving cast of the still poor Bassanio. And he has this incredible dialogue with himself. That is the second piece that we've asked Tara to perform for us.
Certainly, my conscience will serve me to run from this Jew, my master. The fiend is at my elbow and tempts me, saying to me, Gobbo, Launcelot Gobbo, good Launcelot, or good Gobbo, or good Launcelot Gobbo, use your legs, take the start, run away! My conscience says, no! Take heed, honest Launcelot, take heed, honest Gobbo, or as aforesaid, honest Launcelot Gobbo, do not run, scorn running with thy heels. Well, the most courageous fiend bids me pack. Fear, says the fiend. Away, says the fiend. For the heavens rouse up a brave mind, says the fiend. Everyone! Well, my conscience, hanging about the neck of my heart, says very wisely to me, my honest friend Launcelot, being an honest man's son, or rather, an honest woman's son, for indeed my father did something smack, something grow to, he had a kind of taste. Well, my conscience says, Launcelot, budge not! Budge, says the fiend. Budge not, says my conscience. Conscience, say I, you counsel well. Fiend, say I, you counsel well. To be ruled by my conscience, I should stay with the Jew, my master, who, God bless the mark, is a kind of devil. And to run away from the Jew, I should be ruled by the fiend, who, saving your reverence, is the devil himself. Certainly, the Jew is the very devil incarnation, and in my conscience is a kind of hard conscience to offer to counsel me to stay with the Jew. The fiend gives the more friendly counsel. I will run. Fiend, my heels are at your commandment. I will run.
So, Eric, you want to pick up on
Sure,
this one?
sure, because it's actually a fairly familiar internal dialogue in my world. An awful lot of what happens in the kind of the startup world is, you need experienced people. And people talk, it's not just the startup world, of course, it's kind of all over the kind of industrialized world, the so-called war for talent. But, a lot of that means persuading people who've got experience to come and work new enterprise. And I cannot tell you how often I've heard variations on that dialogue, actually sometimes pretty close variations. People coming to my office and saying, I've been at, company X for quite a long time. It's kind of big, it's kind of slow, and I'm really not happy about the impact that it had on the last presidential election, and I'm starting to feel like maybe they're kind of the devil, in literally using those words. Yeah, but on the other hand, I'm, going to this new thing, and it's very risky, and I don't know, I've only got one career, and I'm not sure what I should do. Now, on the other hand, I could stay because the benefits are great, and we're thinking about starting a family, and maybe it's sort of unfair if, my wife can't get the right material. Now, on the other hand, though, the stock option package these guys are offering me, I don't fully understand it, but it really looks good, and some other people I know have done really well. And if you looked at San Francisco real estate recently, and it's so expensive, and I sit there like, hey, it's going to be really hard to help you make this decision. And of course, I can sort of joke about it because you're talking about people going from one kind of stable employment to another kind of stable employment, which I think is sort of what we're talking about here. But I don't think you can discount the underlying anxiety there that really is tied to financial well-being. And we're talking about somebody who doesn't own the enterprise, who doesn't have the means to be able to, set a bunch of ships off sailing, or to have a bunch of money they can lend out, whether for interest or for any other reason. They're the people who are the working class, and they have really tough decisions about where to go, when to go. Timing is difficult. You do feel loyalty. There's a very human loyalty he feels here. I sometimes think, because he refers to Shylock as sort of a devil incarnate. Well, okay, but like I just said, people do that today to me all the time, referring to their current employers, and it's sort of a way to get yourself out of a situation that you're trying to convince yourself you don't want to be part of anymore because you see the glittery new toy over there, the glittery new enterprise that you can join. And certainly if anybody's seen the film version of this from 2004, it's quite interesting that after he leaves Shylock's employ, he gets a brand new, very fancy set of clothes. Oh, they're going to give you a new set of clothes. Well, that's nice. What does that have to do with real employment? Maybe not a whole lot, but I think we all know that it makes a big difference, stuff like that. So I tend to think that speech, even though it is, it does come at a slightly random time, and we don't know that much about the character Lancelot at the time, and he is sort of a bit of a jester character in the play. But I think it goes to something very real that we see today in the economic uncertainty all across certainly the industrialized world as people try to figure out what does it mean to have the steering wheel of your own career, where you don't get to just sign up and stay with one corporation, one master for your whole life and feel real security in that. What does it mean to have to make those decisions? I think it's a kind of anxiety that didn't exist for an awful long time, but sure seems to exist in today's world. So I think it's very relevant.
I think one of the things too that perspective is so interesting about this, because again, I think it cuts into exactly what its function is in the drama itself. Again, I'll wear my Shakespearean hat for a minute, but theater was a risky endeavor in the Renaissance. And Shakespeare's genius, if we are going to agree that he had it, is that he was able to walk a very tight political line, and he was also able to make money. And those two things separate him from his very talented Renaissance dramatist compatriots. And so one of the things I find really interesting about this moment, and it's humorous, it's played by the clown, expertly acted by Tara here to capture that, and in some ways he's selling or trading on the anxiety of his audience. His audience filled mostly with masterless men who moved to London, who were young, seeking fortune, and it may potentially be in really unsavory labor conditions in which they hate their boss and they're begging off for the day, and they may be morally hazardous in more ways than one. And Shakespeare exploits that. He gives them anti-Semitism. He gives a host of humor that, for us in a modern age, also makes us feel anxious about what this play's argument is about difference and about the values, the financial values that we're willing to barter. And so there's a way in which I think this moment in particular, I feel like it's hard, it often gets cut from modern performances because we no longer know what to do with it. And to me, as somebody who's interested in the history of reception, that tells me that there's something psychologically that was working in that original audience in a way that we might find our laughs elsewhere, but it might maybe ask us to think a bit more about those uneasy laughs as well.
Okay, so I will say this is a difficult passage and was cut from the Al Pacino version of the of the Merchant of Venice, which I was cramming with. But fortunately, Tara does it so well, and I've practiced with her. I've seen her practice, so I got some clues. You know, I think actually the way I see this passage, and it's a little related to the way Eric sees it, but maybe a little bit different, is, again, I see the play as in part playing with this transition from a time when money and finance and wealth is transferred largely within the family, largely in this dynastic way, to more mercantile system, eventually, you know, looking forward, Shakespeare doesn't know this, but like eventually to industrialization. And so to me, when I think of this passage, you know, at first I think a kind of interesting piece about it is the guilt and the loyalty piece, because we're kind of moving from a period where a servant would be sort of socialized to think of their employer in that way of, do I owe you loyalty? Do I owe you, what do I owe you? I have been in your household for a long time, to you and I have a contractual relationship. If I fulfill my contract, you know, then I'm just going to go fulfill my contract with somebody else, right? The idea of a kind of very arm's length economic relationship with an employer, which, you know, will be more institutionalized later, but the economy is sort of transitioning to. That's kind of one of the ways I see this scene, in that, you know, he's actually a thing that's funny is he's moving from what's probably a pretty sure thing to something that's probably a little bit risky, though the employer he's moving to looks rich, even though he isn't rich. So not sure how he's perceiving the risks. But, you know, this kind of idea of, do I owe loyalty to the person who, you know, fundamentally we have a relationship of economic convenience to, I think is, you know, an interesting part of the kind of development of economic history that the play is exploring.
Yeah. I definitely agree. Think about that as a. I mean, the play is about that moment in economic history, right? When we're switching from a family to a public sense of where wealth gets generated. And the other thing I love about this really difficult and wonderfully performed piece of Lancelot's is the kind of, like, you're at a position of stasis, right? You can't tell if you should be with the one devil or the other devil, or the devil you know or the devil you know, like where you're supposed to go. And the thing that sort of breaks the tie for him is his obsession with movement, with budging and running and going. And I think of that's also his role in the play. He's the middleman who goes between, he's the only character who goes inside Shylock's house and inside Antonio's house, and is, you know, in the Jewish and the Christian households, he moves the money around, both licitly and illicitly, and he becomes this kind of representation and a kind of structural force in the play for the circulation of exchange, for things going from place to place. And I think of that as one of the, like, that's both attractive, it makes a good play, it produces the drama and the engagement that we see, and it's also really frightening. Like it's through that exchange that we get both the production of wealth and happiness that the play produces, and also the production and expression of violence and cruelty. So that's one of the reasons I love that weird speech so much. So then we're going to come now to Portia and to the most famous speech in the play, the Quality of Mercy speech. And I'll just briefly say, this is a speech that, it's the speech you sort of maybe memorized in high school, and I've always kind of hated it. And I'm a Shakespearean, so I'm supposed to like the good speech, like the famous speeches, as well as the obscure ones. But I've always thought that there was something a little bit like Portia's offer of mercy, which she immediately takes back, and then takes Shylock's money and also his spiritual loyalty to his religion. 50 lines later, it always seemed a little bit off to me. And the one time I've heard it performed that it really spoke to me on a kind of human and emotional level was when I saw Tara play it in the St. John's Law School Moot Courtroom in 2012. Mm-hmm. So I'm also particularly excited to share with everybody today a reprise of that speech, which Tara will give for us now.
The quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. It is twice blessed. It blesseth him that gives and him that takes. 'Tis mightiest in the mightiest. It becomes the throned monarch better than his crown. His scepter shows the force of temporal power, the attribute to awe and majesty, wherein doth sit the dread and fear of kings. But mercy is above this sceptered sway. It is enthroned in the hearts of kings. It is an attribute to God himself, and earthly power doth then show likest God's when mercy seasons justice. Therefore, Jew, though justice be thy plea, consider this, that in the course of justice none of us should see salvation. We do pray for mercy, and that same prayer doth teach us all to render the deeds of mercy. I have spoke thus much to mitigate the justice of thy plea, which if thou follow this strict court of Venice must needs give sentence against the merchant there. Thank you.
And so just briefly before we talk about this together, the speech obviously is going to be hitting the concept of mercy. It's the central, mercy is a political and theological concept, but the sort of title I gave it in the structure of this panel is generosity, and it might be that there's a little slippage between those terms. Portia is a figure for generosity toward everyone except Shylock, but she is both the desired source of wealth that Bassanio is really shooting that arrow out at in Act 1, and she also becomes, she is ready to provide for everyone in the end of the fourth and the fifth acts. And so maybe as we discuss it, we might think a little bit about what the relationship is between mercy and generosity.
If I may jump in, the speech comes in response to, I think, a misstep of Portia's in the courtroom where she says, "Then must the Jew be merciful." And Shylock says, "On what compulsion must I? Tell me that." So I think the quality of mercy speech comes out of a response to that, realizing she's made a mistake, that you can't compel mercy, it has to be given. So I think that's a connection to generosity, that you can't make somebody do it. They have to do it because they choose to.
The quality of mercy is not strained. Mm-hmm. Portia starts from that fact, offers it up as a truth, almost natural truth. And of course, what this play shows us is that depends upon your perspective. And in some ways, that sense of a mercy that is abundant, is easily abundant, a double blessing, and mighty in the mightiest, is coming from a perspective of someone who has more affluence and abundance than she knows what to do with. And what's so interesting about this moment for me teaching it is that what happens when it is strained? What happens when you can't afford that level of gratitude or grace or mercy. The play's asking us to think above its own money culture, and yet it's also reminding us that not everyone has that luxury, and that indeed it might be a luxury. This is, as you'll see in the performance, a moment of incredible exclusionary working in the play. We see how the failure to be merciful not only dooms Shylock's quest for justice, but also excludes him from almost every kind of affective bond one can have in this world. And to have that happen in this moment of a failure to be abundant feels particularly hard, I think. I think that's why I come in and I hate this play, this moment, this speech particularly. It seems cruel, right, to ask someone to rise above a station that they may not be able to. The other piece I think that's here, and there's lots of ways Shakespeareans have talked a lot about what the difference is, the religious coding of justice versus mercy, a Jewish justice that's linked to the Old Testament and a Christian mercy that's linked to the New, is relevant here as well. She's asking Shylock to have a worldview, to have a universal truth that's not indeed universal. And so it feels particularly flawed in that, and you can feel that compulsion, that social compulsion in which he's asked to answer for it. But the other piece that I think really just in teaching this with business students is that one way we might think about justice is an accounting or a turn to the past or reckoning. And then one way we might think about mercy is a future-oriented hedge. A willing to will oneself into a new way of being, one that can transcend the reality that we're in that moment. And one of the brilliance of this production that you all see is that it was developed in a location steeped in that history in the Jewish ghettos of Venice, not Shakespeare's Venice, which is a fiction and a fantasy and has no ghetto. I think that this play, the production you'll see, is set there, pushes on that fantasy of what money is, but that it's also set in a courtyard of a law school, really emphasizes to me the importance of having both justice and mercy work together.
I would add in that, what I was sort of struck by, because I think, again, there's a lot of sort of resonance to the modern day, and I'm neither a Shakespearean nor a lawyer, so I'm about to get myself in trouble here. But, it sort of strikes me that as you watch the scene unfold, Portia is, of course, dressed up as a judge and is sort of playing that role. We know that as the audience, but nobody else knows that. And I think it's very interesting to have the person who, in a way, is sort of in charge of interpreting and applying the law to decide instead, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to give this guy an out, in a way. I'm going to give him an out. And I'm going to try, I agree with you, by the way, there's definitely a game of, game theory would say, remember, it's a multiplayer game here, and if you don't show mercy to him, someone's not going to show mercy to you. I think that does come true. But I do think it's sort of interesting that here's the person who's sort of in charge of applying the law, and instead of saying, well, here's exactly what's going to happen, go forth and do it, she sort of tries to talk him out of it, and nobody seems to think that that's inappropriate, I think partly because it does sort of seem like the punishment doesn't really fit the crime here. And so there's this sort of interpretive thing that gets rejected, and then, she gets him on a technicality, right? And we're like, oh, how many times have we seen that? It's like, pound of flesh, sure, but for those that don't remember, pound of flesh, sure, but no blood. No blood. I'm like, man, I've seen that play out in so many like copyright cases or whatever. That's right. That is how it actually goes in the end, if you really want to read the rule of the law. So it's interesting how sort of the letter of the law ends up producing the right outcome here, even though it seems like the letter of the law isn't necessarily going to produce the right outcome. And I think there's got to be some sort of high-level lesson that you take away from that, because that has turned out to be, I would venture to say, the ultimate multiplayer game, in that it just keeps on playing over and over and over again. And I think, if no one minds my making the comment, I think it's one of the reasons that some of us are kind of nervous about the current climate, where it seems like the rule of law is being subjected to some uncertainty that perhaps it doesn't deserve. So I think that's a different resonance that I certainly see when I'm looking at some of the large tech companies who I would say, sort of having been offered some opportunities to do the right thing politically, perhaps haven't done it, And I suspect some of them are going to find they don't like the technicalities that get visited upon them over the next several years. How's that for talking in code?
Yeah, I one of the things I find so maddening and fascinating about this speech is the play between, I mean, obviously the play between justice and mercy is the structural component of this middle of the trial scene. And yet, as you say, it is a both, like Portia tries to have it both ways. She both wants to claim the mantle of the spirit, which transcends the law and seasons justice with mercy and allows for compassion or human values to escape from the box that the bond has put you in. And yet then the real way out of that bond for her is this hyperliteralism. You know, a hyperliteralism that sort of imagines that there's a way to conceive of flesh without blood, right? Which is itself, you know, the sort of like the literally bloodless fantasy that the merchant is, you know, that you could cut the pound of flesh out and not, you know, get the exact pound, get no blood. There's this desire both to imagine. I mean, again, and I think it comes back really to the first speech with Bassanio too, which is that every time this play asks for money, it also asks for love. And every time the play asks for love, it's also, you know, passing money under the table, or actually in this play mostly right on top of the table, right in full view. Like there's the sense that these two things are, I mean, they are in tension with each other, but they're always accompanying each other. And that's the part of Merchant of Venice that I think is so incredibly contemporary, in the sense that, I mean, whether Prescient is a tricky one, but I think that it is like we're still in that world in which our human and emotional values are intertwined with the decisions we make about money and risk and generosity. That, you know, in the way we raise our children, and the way we, you know, spend our money, and the way we, you know, buy our theater tickets to the festival. I mean, all these things are sort of intertwined with both the emotional and the financial. So in a couple minutes, I want to sort of throw it open to questions from the audience, and I was wondering if our panel, before we cede the microphones, if people want to have one sort of final question. Judy, I sort of cut you off on the last one, but or one final sense of like, what is the takeaway that you would have about Merchant of Venice in the context that we're talking about it today?
Okay, well, it's hard to come up with one.
Yeah.
Actually, let me say a little bit about the mercy speech to maybe raise one. I think one lens through which to view the mercy speech, which I think dovetails into your view about generosity and the festival, and is the backdrop of the mercy speech is, you know, why are we having this kind of torturous argument in court about this contract, which, you know, it seems like, really, are we really going to do this? In part because, and it's laid out so clearly in the play, that there's this discussion that, you know, Venice as a community to succeed as a kind of haven for commerce has to be a place where people think their contracts will be enforced, right? And the Duke brings that up very explicitly, and that's kind of I think of that as the backdrop for the mercy speech, and a little bit for Shylock's response, and also, you know, maybe a way to think about that whole part of the play, right? Much of the play is about individual interpersonal relationships and how they get mixed up with money, but this is the piece that's really about putting that together with the goals and aims of this community, which, you know, maybe hasn't really sat down as a group and collectively agreed on goals and aims, but the sort of idea that, you know, if Venice isn't a place where someone can enforce contracts, then Venice will not be a place that thrives for commerce. And Shylock is like understanding that and exploiting that by taking his claim so far. And I think one of the reasons Portia's backed into this corner is it would be easier for all of them if Shylock backed down and they didn't have to rule against him. And, he refuses to do it, in part because, why would this guy stand up for this community, which, the community has failed him so much. And so, I think much of the play is really about these kind of awkward interplays on the individual level with money. But this is really asking people to have some communal sense in a kind of failed and divided community.
Yeah, that seems really important.
I think, again, that communal sense is sort of my answer to what this play means now and why I'm willing to risk teaching it. There's always that sort of moment. I struggle every semester about whether it needs to be on or off the syllabus. The history's hard, the language is hard. These are first-year students, many whom this is their only humanities class that they're taking, and it's a lot to ask. But one of the concepts of the course is that literature allows us to explore philosophical ideas, but with details. And the details, I think, are what matter and what we need practice with. And this play has all the taboos, religion, sex, love, money. If we can practice how to talk about a play as difficult as this one, then I think we are equipping ourselves to enter into a very complex money culture that our students already have to navigate in. And so that's one of the values that I see in this. The other piece of this, and I do think it's kind of ironic, but the strongest argument that I usually have about why it stays on the syllabus is that it does offer us a reminder of the power of money, of what its value might be. And that is, it can bring different people to the table in ways that we don't normally find if we are thinking about religious culture or other kinds of embodied difference. And it provides a shared index of value that we need to be careful about how we articulate unstated norms. But if we do contract for it, then we may have some tools that allow us to work together and to come to agreed upon terms. Now, the play gives us that fantasy and then takes it away from us in very violent and horrific ways. But there's something about that opening act of negotiation, Act 1, Scene 3, that I find really compelling in all kinds of ways. That these two men have history with one another, that they do not like one another, that they're able to articulate that clearly and yet still do business. Seems to me to have a potential that's worth thinking about, that it's not idealistic or rosy, but it is very practical.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, from my point of view, again, I guess we're sort of on the theme of why Merchant of Venice now in 2018. I mean, why pay attention to it, why stage it? And I will say, coming back to the play after several years since I last read it, and kind of reading it with a thought to the money culture, I kind of came into it and I was like, oh yeah, this is, of course, is the play where they're, it's a religious play, basically. It's the Christians against Shylock. And reading it, of course, I go, okay, the depiction is sort of, as I remembered, pretty crude. But it's also been interesting to me to look at it and think, boy, there's a lot here that's relevant from the point of view of kind of the interplay between fairness and justice. Strikes me as something very important to this play, where you do sort of get the sense that the deal that was struck was not fair, even though the participants involved on both sides feel like, well, a deal's a deal, we've got to go forward with it. There is sort of this sense that a larger justice does in the end come through, and that the larger justice seems to be, I guess, sort of Shakespeare's way of saying, look, the rule of law is the thing that's going to help us survive our baser instincts. And I mean, that is a bit of a bloodless way of looking at the world, to be sure. But I did sort of find myself thinking, yes, it's about money, but in the way that money inflames passions. And there does need to be something that dampens those passions and allows us all to live in the world in a sort of a sane way. And it does sort of seem like the big lesson for me comes out of this, is not necessarily a passionate fight of religions, although I understand how that interpretation can be taken. It's more that the thing that will make things work out okay in the end is common respect for the rule of law. And I did sort of come away from it feeling like that. So to me, that seems very relevant to today, even though you have to approach it clearly with sort of this thought that, hey, there's some really distasteful stuff in here, and I can only imagine with young students, you've got to lay the table of context pretty deeply so that people don't take the wrong thing away from teaching it. But it sure seems relevant to me still.
I'll jump in very quickly. One thing that sort of came up for me throughout our discussion today and listening to a number of different things was how these ideas of risk and anxiety and generosity and money culture also relate to theater producing, that every theater production is a risk. Every performance is a risk. You're always anxious about it, whether the audience will show up, when they do show up, are you going to trip or fall or forget your lines? So there's a lot of risk and anxiety on sort of all levels of producing in that respect. But also the idea of generosity, that it can be about something more than money, and that the giving of art is also something that I think the play is also about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that that one of the reasons that I keep coming back to this play is it seems so acute about both the psychological cost of valuing everything in monetary terms, and also, and I think this is Holly's really fantastic point about the beginning of the play especially, there's a kind of utopian sense of building a civic money culture that actually makes it possible to live with people who are unlike each other, right? That it actually builds a kind of civic culture. And I think that, this is maybe more broadly about Shakespeare in this play and elsewhere, is that he's incredibly acute both about that possibility and about the human tendency to break those civic cultures through cruelty and exclusion. And so you both get the image of it and the cost of not being able to follow into that utopian moment. And I think that is a really acute way of thinking about this, of posing that question through this play. The other thing that I think, thinking about in relation to, we'll go to questions from the audience in a minute, but I hope that many people in this room will go see the production over the course of the next several days. We tried to see it last night, but we got rained out after about 70 lines at the dress rehearsal. But the thing that I didn't include in any of the speeches that we performed is the part of Shylock. And the part of Shylock has really become, in modern production of this play, and the Pacino film is the great example, it's become the star vehicle. It's become the biggest part in the play with the biggest speeches. And I think that I haven't seen this production, but I've read about its earlier incarnations, and I think that what Karen Coonrod does with the part of Shylock is I'm incredibly excited to see it later in the week, and she really is attentive to the complex humanity and cruelty that is both visited upon and comes out of this figure. And part of what I wanted to do in this conversation with everybody is to think about the structures that are built around, around both the merchant and the moneylender and the heiress and all these figures, that it seems to me a play that oddly lacks the truly central, kind of obsessively centralized figure in some ways, and it is about system, about how we negotiate systems that are changing, communities that are inviting and excluding, the desire to move between those communities, to move out of your father's house and into your eventual husband's house, which is taken in a very drastic way by Shylock's daughter Jessica, and that sense of the kind of circulation that human culture and civic culture and money culture all require of us, I think is one of the sort of obsessive fascinations and models that this play provides. and I hope we'll see some of you at the Yale Law School courtyard over the course of the week.
Enjoy.